Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Drew Mucci. I'm co-president at HIT Contracting, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to our first master series of 2022. It's definitely a hot topic in today's discussion and one across our market. We're going to talk today a lot about supply chain, and we're going to go through a number of different pieces and hit the highlights, basically on how we got to where we are today, how it's impacting our pricing, what some of the strategies are that we're going through in order to get past these challenges, and what does it all mean, and how does each component kind of play on top of each other. So a couple of housekeeping items. You can receive AIA credit for today's course, and the information is posted on the screen. We also want to thank everybody that provided questions in advance. That was a huge help. We'll do our best to answer all of them, and we've combined a lot of the responses within the presentation we're about to talk to you today. And for any additional questions, please place them in the chat box, and we're going to answer as many as we can as we get close to the end of the session. Okay, so quick safety moment. We start every one of our meetings with a safety moment or any presentation. This is a quick and light one, but basically as we're transitioning into the springtime, everybody wants to get outside. I don't know what it is in other parts of the country, but today on the East Coast and Mid-Atlantic, it's going to be a little bit warmer this afternoon, maybe in the high 60s. So what does that do? Kids coming home from school want to be out on the roads, playing in the streets, doing all the things that you like to do during spring. So as conscious drivers, we got to really make sure we're paying attention that there's been this shift, right? So no longer winter, moving into spring. Think about what you're doing as you're driving down the road. That ball could come out of nowhere across the street. Be sure you're paying attention, and absolutely make sure you're not looking at your phone. Okay, so by way of introductions, I'd like to welcome Gail Susan. Gail's our VP of Pre-Construction. He oversees all the pricing efforts that go through the company, and he personally has invested a lot of time into the topic that we're going to talk about today. And then also Lavette Lagan, who's our research manager and is constantly analyzing the economy, trends, and how they impact many of our businesses and our market sectors. So we're very thrilled to be here today. So let's kick it off with Lavette.
Thanks, Drew. I thought we'd start by talking through a few of the big disruptors to our supply chain over the past several years to set the stage. Since 2018, the supply chain has been riddled with issues. Of course, none have compared to the effects of the pandemic, but I thought it was still important to highlight some notable disruptions along the chain, starting with the U.S. issuing tariffs on steel and aluminum in March of 2018. The U.S. issuing tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum products in March of 2018, effectively placing a tax on every foreign shipment of those metals into the U.S. Tariffs will fall most heavily on our allies, such as Canada, which supplies steel and aluminum to American companies and the military. The following month, steel prices would increase 6.9% year over year. 1 year after imposing tariffs, the United States announced an agreement with Canada and Mexico to remove tariffs for steel and aluminum imports from these countries. Following the lifts, prices on steel dropped 13% year over year. Then there was the pandemic, which brought the world to a screeching halt. Manufacturing plants shut down, massive layoffs, and lockdown restrictions that would hinder certain parts of the economy. In February, a winter storm hit the southeast Texas area, wreaking havoc to its power grids and also affecting data centers. The Texas freeze also shut down semiconductor manufacturers, oil and gas refineries, and major transportation hubs. Speaking of transportation hubs, the panic buying frenzy we experienced during the lockdown increased imports and left cargo ships awaiting berths at record highs throughout 2021. And lastly, one of the most notable natural disasters was Hurricane Ida touching down on Texas and Louisiana in August of 2021, adding major strains to an overwhelmed supply chain. The storm temporarily shut down the Port of New Orleans, increasing shipping delays and shortages. The hurricane also had a significant impact on U.S. oil production, leaving roughly 12% of U.S. oil production at a standstill. So now I want to shift to consumer spending and how that affected inflation. At the onset of the pandemic, the U.S. has shut down, and so did consumer spending. In April of 2020, consumer spending declined 16% year over year. You can kind of see it there on the line where you had the COVID lockdown begins, and we see this massive dip. Consumer spending didn't return to pre-pandemic levels until 2021. This was due to the American Jobs Act providing 3 rounds of stimulus, causing spending to increase 30% just 1 year after the start of the pandemic, something that no one expected. The shortages, coupled with the uptick in consumer demand, would cause an imbalance in the supply and demand, and the result was a 7% annual increase in consumer pricing at year-end. We're continuing to battle inflation with the most recent numbers for February at an all-time high of 7.9%. While consumer spending has moderated from the period when Americans received a second round of stimulus checks, it's still up 11.8% year over year. Which brings me to the activity at the port. The pandemic drove a sharp decline in imported goods of 16% in April 2020. Like the pattern we saw in consumer spending. The lockdown resulted in a shift from service-oriented society and kind of buoyed the imports of goods. We rebounded quickly, but the month-over-month pace rose so sharply it burned through the inventory and put a massive strain on the supply chain. As of the last reading, imports for real goods were up 16% higher than pre-pandemic levels and nearly 40% higher since the trough in April of last year. The influx of spending boosted demand for goods, causing congestion at the ports. Here's a slide for weekly container ships awaiting berths at all U.S. ports. Remember, by July, America had received 3 stimulus checks and had a massive amount of pent-up savings. The number of vessels awaiting on berths at all U.S. ports was a little bit more than 60. By September, that number had doubled, and while the number of vessels awaiting berths is important, so is the time spent. Prior to the pandemic, we would see vessels waiting berths no more than 2 hours. Post-pandemic, that number has increased to 20 days, adding extra lead time to materials. Going into 2022, port activity is still an issue despite ports switching to 24-hour schedules. Over the holidays, the number of vessels awaiting berths peaked at 138. We saw that number decline slightly last month with reports of a little bit less than 100 vessels awaiting berths. However, part of that slowdown was tied to manufacturing plants shutting down for the Lunar New Year in Asia. The developing conflict, which we'll discuss further, is actually going to result in more congestions at the ports. In addition to the overburdening ports, workforce and equipment shortages contributed to the supply chain disruptions. Both warehouse and truck transportation employment lost nearly 6% of its employees at the start of the pandemic. The warehousing sector rebounded after 2 months, recovering all jobs lost as of May of 2020. That's the line in the blue here. And would go on to see a 37% increase year over year by December of last year with 1.7 million employees. Trucking didn't fare as well. Unlike the warehousing sector, it took 14 months to recover all the jobs lost, adding less than 1% month over month. The trucking industry hasn't been able to catch up with the spending frenzy. Overall, trucking has increased 8.4% year over year, but that's 2.7% from where we were prior to the pandemic. Overall, the tightening labor market for drayage drivers is further exacerbating the port challenges that we're seeing. So when we look at the impacts from the port, according to the Logistics Manager Index, inventory costs are up, warehousing prices are up, as well as transportation costs. They're all growing. At the ports, ocean shipping executives say that they expect the rates set in many annual contracts will be doubled this year compared to agreements struck early in 2021 prior to the supply chain bottlenecks. Domestic shipping rates for moving goods by road and rail were up 23% according to CAS Information Systems, which handles freight payments for a large portion of companies. The shortage of warehousing and drayage employees has resulted in penalty costs for the extra days that containers sit on the yard, and distributors are passing these price increases along to offset shipping costs. Now we're going to talk about the impacts of the supply chain, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Gail.
Great. Thank you, Livette. Again, we talked about the cause of the supply chain disruptions. Now we're going to talk about the effects. During the start of the pandemic, pricing for materials was down year to year by nearly 2%. By August of 2020, that average increase rose to 5% month over month. In 2021, things got worse. The ice storm in February, the hurricane in August, both down there on the Gulf Coast, and the delays to the ports helped exacerbate these problems. That rose our average to 25% month over month. And then by the end of 2021, that nearly rose 300 points, marking a 33% increase. Now how are we seeing that? Or we are seeing it in on the left-hand side, the non-metallic products, which are concrete, lumber, plywood, plastics, and gypsum, up 13%. On processed goods, our asphalt, sand, gravel, steel, and copper scrap up 38%. Metal products such as steel, metal pipe and tube, sheet metal, prefabricated metal buildings up 42%. The chart on the right-hand side shows the rise of these products since the start of the pandemic to now. It does not show the peaks that we experienced. Some examples are like lumber back in 2020, certainly structural steel back in 2021. With that, metal products are the largest uptick at 42% over the year. A lot of our clients have asked us, what are the most volatile construction materials that you guys are seeing over there at HIT? And it has to be these three: steel, the petrochemicals, copper, and brass. What does all that mean? I tried to put it all on the screen here. It's probably too much to read, but I'll just try to go over it in an overview, but some of the slides later, you'll catch a little bit more of it there. But overall, steel has to be the largest. It's not only just the structural steel, but it's virtually all of the packages that we buy during the construction process has some form of steel. Similar with petrochemicals. Petrochemicals, that's really the rubber, the polyiso insulation, the mastics or the glue, the waterproofing, the paint, PVC, and the list goes on and on and on, just like with the copper and brass. And then the final demand here, again, we previously discussed the net inputs for the construction year to year. Here we look at the net inputs to construction month over month compared to bid prices, the green versus the blue. Material prices were volatile since the start of the pandemic, while bid prices were steadily increased over that same time frame. However, the last 5 months, since September of 21 on, the material input prices are still volatile, but the bid prices have significantly increased, up 2.1% average month over month. Okay, this chart over here, a lot of information over here as well, but let me start with the left-hand side. We created this chart to the left to show the delivery times of pre-pandemic deliveries versus during pandemic deliveries. These results are from our boots on the ground. We asked a question to our national HIT team across the country. What are the experiences that you're feeling right now with lead times? We did this back in Q4 of 2021. Amazingly enough, here we are in March of 2021. Things have changed. So we asked the same question to the same people all over again. And here's some of the feedback we're getting, because we really wanted to find out, have some things gotten better? Are some things getting worse? Or are some things probably staying about the same? All right, here we go. Structural steel. We were starting to see improvement through the end of 21 into the beginning of 22. However, in these past few weeks, we're starting to see a rise in increase of cost of coil, HSS, and plate. Another big one we're seeing is reinforcing steel and post-tensioning cables. These have been on the rise over literally the past 4 to 6 weeks now. And what we're learning, it's due to the lack of the raw materials, which is driving up the cost and limiting the supply. The conflict in Eastern Europe has a direct effect on the supply of these raw materials. In fact, we were advised by one of our major vendors for post-tensioning cables that they were going to take a pause. They were going to take a pause on pricing new work. Unheard of, right? Because of the lack of materials. They've been working to find alternative sources for those raw materials, but we fully anticipate this year further disruptions in the supply chain for rebar and post-tensioning. What does that mean? Increase of cost and potentially some vendor allocations. Another one, roofing, still the same. Unfortunately, we're still in that same kind of mess we were in back in 2021. That's the membrane systems, the polyiso insulation boards. We're still hearing those materials are beyond 9-month deliveries. That also feeds into insulation. Insulation in general, pre-pandemic, that material was really in stock. Now it's 3 to 4 months out. Another item here is steel products. Steel products, I'm meaning by metal piping or conduit. We use those in site utilities, conduits for sprinkler, conduits in plumbing, mechanical, and electrical systems, all being delayed. Wood, unlike the lumber that we experienced back in 2020, those premiums, those have come down. Now we're seeing wood in the doors and cabinets and casework, primarily in the MDF and the particle boards, where we're hearing that they're 8 weeks out. Here's some of the other bigger ticket line items: mechanical equipment, right? That's the air handling units, the rooftop units. Those are extending beyond 4-month delivery times. Probably the largest ticket item that we're experiencing right now is electrical. That's the gear. Gear, I'm meaning by transformers, switchboards, panels, cables, the generators, lighting control, busway. I mean, the list goes on. It's pretty hard what we're fighting right now with these electricians. And it's really coming from their vendors and their suppliers. We're hearing those deliveries in that 50 to 60 week time zone. Really, over the past 2 months, we've been digging further with our subcontractors to find out where it's coming from. And they've been sharing with us the letters from all the manufacturers like Schneider Electric, Square D, Eaton, and multiple lighting representatives to give us the data to show us whether these are cost escalations, or supply chain, raw materials, and we're getting it from all over. And here are a couple examples we faced during the pandemic on cost escalation. This first one is a corporate interiors project. We bid this out in 2020. Unfortunately, it got delayed into 2021, and what happened? We experienced a 7% increase in costs, and on the right-hand side, you can see the packages. You can see the double-digit increases of those packages, right? This next example, this is a base building project. We bid this in April of 21, anticipated start date of summer of 21. Unfortunately, that slipped until February of 22. What happened? An 8% increase. Again, notice the similar packages, not as extreme as that corporate interiors job, but pretty significant because we're talking about larger dollar values here as well. So again, we're talking to our trade subcontractors nationally every single day across the country, and what we're finding out is that all of our subcontractors are way over their capacity, both financially and operationally, struggling really to keep up. Then really what's happening is waiting to award a job after the job bids. That's a risk for escalation. We got to avoid that risk. What we've got to keep on looking at those opportunities to do is bring on our subcontractor partners early and really lock down those subcontractors so we can help eliminate those risks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Drew, and he's going to talk about strategies that we found to help mitigate the effects of the supply chain disruptions.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Yeah, it's a wonder why Gail doesn't have as much gray hair as I do when he has to fight through this on a daily basis. But I think all of our teams are constantly fighting these battles. You know, and really some of the nuances within that information, you start to see that, you know, a 2% increase month over month. If you have a job that's going through budget stages every month for 5 months, you're up 10% in a 5-month, you know, period of time. So, you know, we're watching these price increases spike each time. And so trying to navigate the pricing is one, you know, really difficult component. The secondary piece is once we get into building a job, how are we dealing with the supply chains? So there was a lot of questions that were asked on what our forecast is on supply chain issues. You know, when are they expected to subside, and whether this is, you know, still a short-term issue or is it a long-term problem? You know, and to be very honest and really candid, we don't know. We don't know because every day it seems like there's another component that pops up that has a different challenge. But from what we are seeing, you know, our opinion, my opinion specifically, is I think 18 to 20 months is optimistic that we're still within this problem. And it's probably the soonest you start to see any real meaningful relief across all the different packages that Gail's laid out for all the different reasons that we're going to talk about. So what's complicating, you know, the overarching issue is that the components are all being affected by a confluence of complications. So it's not just one straightforward piece. It's not just the ports. It's not just the manufacturing. It's not just, COVID. It's probably 4 or 5 major factors that are contributing. And that's what's piling on top of us in creating this inability to dig out from underneath it. So, the 4 or 5, COVID, the freeze in Texas that we talked about, the impact that had to the petrochemical delay, as Livette laid out, I think it only scratches the surface. I mean, when you dig down, everything from paint to resin to glue, it all comes from this petrochemical component. And when Texas had the freeze and had the hurricane, that shut down all sorts of places in the ability to still continue manufacturing. Factory shutdowns in China, absolutely impacting. The smallest nuances of components coming from overseas is so large, and how they need to be upfront and early in the production of certain pieces of equipment, that has changed really the dynamic. So if you can't not only get them because the factories are closed down, but then you're waiting, the 20 plus additional days to hit port on top of what was already a strained component, those impacts just continue to build on top of each other. And now with, the latest one with the war in Ukraine, I think we've talked about a few different pieces, and we'll talk a little bit more about them, but really, what's the next one, right? The war in Ukraine not only hits the exports that we talked about from steel, and I'll explain that even further detail, but also like certain ores that are used to produce semiconductor chips, right? Oil, the impact that we're all seeing at the gas pump, think of the impact that's having on supply chain. And so now if the drivers are needed, and they're on contract basis, all those contracts are increasing, and the need for drivers is increasing. So that's just, again, stepping on chop. So what's the next one, right? So when we're asked about what the forecast is, we're taking in bite-sized chunks and trying to, as we say, chop wood, but really there's just seems to be a new one around the corner right now. And so what that's done is expose really the supply chain for how volatile it really is, and also how fractured all of this is when it comes together. So as I talked about with the war in Ukraine, this is a new contributor, right? It's been a little over 4 weeks now since the first, real invasion, and how quickly those things pile up. So here's two real easy examples that I think most can relate to. So if you're speccing or installing or you like a beautiful Italian ceramic, right? The clay that is used to produce the ceramic tiles comes from Ukraine. So at this point, that clay is now not coming from Ukraine. It's having to be sourced from other locations. If there's available sourcing locations, the cost is only growing increasingly high. And so that is just adding to one small piece that you may not have even thought to touch on how that's now, changing one more item that's now in a delay. Gail talked about post-tensioning, right? So to build on that, the cables that are made for post-tension, they're made from rod material, which is refined and reduced into strand, right? And that rod is made from pig iron, which is old ships, steel mills, etc. Unlike rebar, which is made from like old cars and things like that. And the pig iron is a major export from Russia. Now we can all understand, you start to look at that, as Gail said, one of the manufacturers is just going to stop, taking on new work until they can catch up on their own, because they can't be put in a position to be able to still control pricing. I mean, we have pricing efforts that come in where bids are held for 2 days. 2 days. I mean, we don't operate in a business that allows us to move that quickly yet. Now we have to really start thinking about what that means. So here are a couple of the solutions that we look to, and each one's a little bit different. Okay, so national relationships. Our business has always been built on relationships. And the level of those relationships are much further than where we're currently just growing our clients, our A&E partners, our subcontractors, but getting into strengthening those relationships with our manufacturing partners, the distributors, the shipping, the logistics, and the transportation, all the stakeholders, right? Expanding that supply chain or the value chain, and how those relationships are starting to add together, are starting to pay dividends on how we attack these problems as they come up, right? So those trusted relationships have become even more critical. Our teams are constantly digging deep and trying to expand and understand what adjustments can be made in order to move the needle, in order to make some of these lead time issues, come back into a range that we can use to execute the project and still deliver in the time that we said we would, right? And so having that understanding of those components and how things are being made and talking to people to get there is where some of these solutions come together. And I'll give you one example. So we recently had a project that we're actually doing the installation today. But we recently had this project where it's a 12-week lead time for this custom sliding, door system. And it's locally made here in Pennsylvania. And when we were getting the information back, we were being told 12 weeks wasn't even attainable. 14 to 18 weeks is going to be even further. And really, we needed it in 8 weeks. And so, as we reached out, we made some contacts with the owners of the company, started to talk through it with them, trying to understand the process. That 12-week time frame, this company sources all the different components that help make up the doors, and then they put them together in their shop. They test them, they make sure it works, then they ship it out to be installed. So as we started to break down each of those components, you're talking about the aluminum frames, the glass, the motors, all the silicone components. Each of those things need to be in hand before they can even start manufacturing because of the way it's built, right? So when we're asking them how do we shrink the time frame, they're just talking to us saying, listen, we're at the mercy of our suppliers, and as much as we're talking to them, they're hearing it from everybody else too. So what does our team do? We go into action, right? Figuring out these tactical and specific ways of looking at each one. The aluminum ended up being a non-issue because they had plenty of the aluminum frame in stock. But where we did have to go in is the motors. The motors that were being specified were a great product, new, innovative, excellent. But for a few dollars more, we can get one that's in stock that's even stronger than the one that was specified, right? Because the specified motor was out of stock. Okay, no problem. Let's upgrade the motor. Let's change that component, move ahead. Great. So we had that checked off. The next one was the struggle with the glass. And for all these reasons, the manufacturer of the insulated glass unit was way, way behind on keeping up with their obligations, right? And not at their fault, but that's the way the pileup has been continuing to happen. But through relationships with our vendors locally, one of our glass vendors locally had a very strong relationship with the company that's producing the glass. So we talked to them, we worked through some strategies, we talked about timing. If we can get certain pieces and break up the delivery, it allows us to start other manufacturing components so that we're not waiting for the entire delivery to come. We were able to mitigate all that through in order to get the material to the company to build it, and then for them to go ahead and do all their testing, build the doors, and we're installing literally within 1 day of when we anticipated, when we had scheduled the installation, 12 or 14 weeks ago. So we're going to hit the date. And all of that took, probably 3 to 4 weeks of pulling teeth to get the information, pulling each string to see where it's going so that we can make sure we know all those components. That's what our teams are doing on a continual basis. And none of it would be able to be possible if we didn't have our trade partner relationships and our manufacturing relationships. So weekly, I lead our business unit leader meeting, and that's where, as a leadership team, we take time to discuss the latest issues. We brainstorm through these ideas. We try to triage the situations as they come up, and then we use our network, to drive that project solution for success in order to build those components. We're also working with shipping companies, understanding how the ships are routing, how the trucks are routing, how can we, support materials. Right now, with the limit of the available shipping opportunities, many trucks are waiting for to be fully packed for their deliveries to be most efficient. Well, if we talk to them and we go ahead and get a dedicated truck, more often than not, it's going to cost a few dollars more, but we can get things expedited, right? We can get it on our own direct truck. We can get it here for delivery. We can work with customs to drive those pieces in order to get them off the port onto the trucks. So all of those situations driving to those relationships are what makes this work happen. All right, so the next one, early procurement. Now, this isn't a new strategy, but how we're doing early procurement and the things we're looking at is a new view to the world, given all the supply chain issues that we're having, right? So now more than ever, having the contractor on board early, really early in the process is critical, because that allows us to develop some strategies and come up with a tactical plan in order to work around some of the inflationary issues and supply chain issues. So being early on in the procurements allowed us to do some pre-purchasing of long lead items way in advance of even the job site needing them. Perfect example, we had a project going into a new building. right? We were awarded the job in July of 21, and the construction didn't start until January of 22, right? And this was a fully priced job. And at that time, the metal stud pricing was escalating at 10% a month. And on top of it, there was an allocation issue. And then on top of that, the escalation would continue until you received goods on site. So you couldn't just lock in the price by guaranteeing the order. Until you actually received it, you couldn't lock yourself out of the escalation issues. So what did we do? We really started to think through, and as a strategy, we said, okay, we have a building sitting there that's unoccupied. The tenant's going to be going in and doing that work. We have a cost issue now. Why don't we procure all the metal now, land it in the building, so we can skip through all the price increases, give ourselves an opportunity to hit the ground running day one, and work through that with the landlord. So we presented that to the client. We worked through the solutions, and sure enough, we even helped pay the upfront costs in order to bring ourselves up to January and to enable the subs to get out there, load the building, and beat those escalation increases. So those innovative strategies are what really that early procurement can give you, and that's just one of many. I mean, we talk to all different pieces that need that little bit of insight and those adjustments that can make a much larger difference. All right, so the next item that we have up here is going to be the project management piece, right? And so again, it's a tactic. It's attacking a project and the situations immediately and going beyond that first phone call. So this is when we're in construction, right? One of the biggest frustrations we're having right now that's seemingly new and it's seemingly to happen on a consistent basis daily is even when we've locked in all these things, even when someone's telling us they're going to deliver a piece of equipment next week, within 2 days of that delivery date, we then get a phone call and say, it's not next week, it's now 3 more weeks before we can get it to you. I mean, you're talking days before it's supposed to show up, and you're trying to plan accordingly. So how do you work through that? Well, quickly attacking that problem aggressively is what we need to do. And so, with COVID, part of the problem has been it's driven companies to have their workers or their employees, fragmented across their footprint. So people could be working at home, project management teams for certain design pieces can be working, in different locations. You have people doing shop drawings behind the scenes, not necessarily sitting next to the project management team anymore. And what all that does is it causes that fragmented delay in getting the right information from the right person, right? So that little bit of COVID fog is still here, and it doesn't seem like it's lifting anytime soon. So we had an example where, and this one's somewhat generic, but it happens probably on a weekly basis, where just like I said, we had VAV boxes which control the air above the ceiling. We're tracking them down to within 4 days of delivery. We had something like 40 boxes that were going to be delivered in 4 days. We had crews set up. It's already, tight and out of sequence anyway. It should have been delivered way before that, but we're working through those pieces. We got confirmation of delay. We're feeling good. We get the call that the boxes aren't coming. And they're not coming not for another additional week, but for 3 more weeks. And that just would have absolutely put us in a terrible position with delivery of the project and with the client. So we dug in deep to try to understand the issue. The issue wasn't anything to do with the actual construction of the VAV box. This is simple construction. It's sheet metal and some dampers. But the provided controls that go on the box that are sourced from a different person to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer then puts them on in the shop and ships them out, those control panels weren't coming when they thought when they were supposed to come in order to make that consecutive handoff. So what did we do? We worked with the manufacturer of the boxes and the controls to say, okay, ship us the boxes without the controls. We'll go ahead and pay for the labor for the controls contractor to come out, install them on the boxes after they're already in the ceiling when you get your hands on them, do all that programming and commissioning on site. Now, it added some complexity to how we work through and close up the ceilings, but we saved ourselves that additional 3 weeks, squeezed it back down, and we're able to still hit the deadlines that we needed to hit in order of thinking outside the box and trying to make sure we understand what actually goes into that delay and not just stop at that first phone call. So that project management and that aggressive project management is really we're relying more and more on every day. All right, 2 more. So early payment, this is critical right now. As Gail talked about, capacity is over capacity. This is the scary zone, I think, when it comes to too many people taking on work because of the capacity that we have, and then if one thing happens to a subcontractor from their payment and their cash flow, if they don't have that financial solvency, that could end the situation for many. So, what we're trying to do is develop those strategies to continue to look at ways to make sure we're paying our subs, as often as possible, right? Right now, with the wage increase, material increases, there's some projects where subs or trade partners absolutely have already been under contract. They're locked into the material and cost, but those things are still spiking on them, and they're still trying to deal with it. So, having that cash flow is critical. And so we've now shifted from a typical weekly check run, which was outstanding in itself, to now multiple times a week pushing out checks and trying to be the fastest that's paying our trade partners in order to keep that cash flow continuous. And for all of our client partners out there and our A&E partners, we need your help in making sure we're doing this, right? Getting through the payment application as quickly as possible, pushing the cash out for the bills. I mean, all that's doing is ensuring all of these risk pieces to be dampened down slightly enough to keep the project moving. And any chink in that armor has a dramatic effect to the whole downflow of those pieces. So working through those payments, very critical. We're going to continue to bring up our frequency of payments and looking for help to help drive that downstream. Okay, last one, alternative approach. Without a doubt, this is probably my favorite topic, but without a doubt, I think the supply chain challenges, the pricing increases, the COVID, all of this has shed, a much larger light on what challenges are related to the way we deliver and hire our general contractors, our architects, and our subs, how that whole value chain works, right? The GC is always the last one, at the seat of the table. I guess the GC with the subs are the last ones at the seat of the table. And that doesn't provide us a lot of opportunity to advise on cost and schedule in a meaningful way, right? And so we can always give you the lead times. We can always talk to our trade partners, our manufacturers, what are those timing components? But until we can lock somebody in, not just with parts and pieces, but into contracts and making those contracts real and driving the attention to the subs and to the suppliers that this is real and we're moving ahead early, that you have input on how to work through some of these issues, we just keep tripping over the same stumbling blocks. So it's a challenging it's a challenging market for our design partners. Those timeframes are continuing to get squeezed. You're being asked to design to budgets that are continually changing, and not having enough up-to-date information that's coming at a constant basis is absolutely where some of these chinks in the armor are. So really where we can change this is move the engagement with the contractors up early, come up with a budget, and then let's give the opportunities to folks like ourselves to reach down to our trade partners, bring them on, put them under contract, buy materials, look at issues. We'll talk about that in a second, because there's constant design issues that just come through the normal course of work that we can have strong input on. But really getting that full advancement of cost up front and allowing us to do our job, it's going to save a dramatic effect. Just think about this utopia of where you design it with not only us there, but our trade partners, to the point where we're drawing it once. We're not going through a massive VE session. It's not getting on site where it's being re-engineered to what actual field conditions are happening. All of that's being taken advantage of in the upfront time, so that these supply chain issues that might come up during construction, we have a lot more flexibility to deal with them than to try to do all that at the same time. All right. So our teams are constantly flagging these issues as we go through schedule, and we're bringing those suggestions, those alternative materials, and we're trying to and making sure we're still meeting that overall design intent. We've seen success where the clients make decisions based on what's readily available without sacrificing the basis of design. Involving us early and in a meaningful way where we can make real contract commitments to all of our trade partners to get the plan rolling down the path at inception is really where you're going to save not only the time, but also a significant amount of money in the long run. So two case studies we want to show that kind of illustrate a little bit of this. So if you just look at this illustration, look at the numbers that are on the page from a lead time perspective, right? It's dramatic. How do you work within building a building and you can't put material on the roof for 50 weeks, right? So what we did is we worked through this. We changed one layer of vapor barrier to 2. We took the polyiso that's on top of it changed the thicknesses, made sure that we still kept the R rating. We went to a smaller, foil back insulation at the top. We double layered some of the other components. But by working through a design session in the matter of a day or two with our partner at the table, we changed this detail and shrank those 40 and 50-week items down to the 26-week item, which was in line with our overall schedule and was able to deliver, the project in sequence. Because when we get out of sequence, that's when costs really, really get off charts. So being able to deliver in sequence is key. And, under the normal process, this detail would come out in a hard bid scenario. Everybody would price it accordingly. The job would be awarded with some clarifications, and then we'd get into this detail and try and design it on the fly when the building's already going up. And that doesn't work for anybody. So, looking at those assemblies, studying them in the right way, making adjustments to just nuanced items that really don't drive the overall lasting effect is where we want to be. Okay, so I'm going to shift to Livette. She's going to talk about a little bit of the trends to watch for, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Thanks, Drew. I think you're absolutely right. There are still challenges that are affecting our supply chain. I think what we've seen in the last 18, 24 months have highlighted a lot of the vulnerabilities. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't go through some of the trends that we're currently watching to make sure we're staying abreast of other supply chain challenges that are to come. One is the China's zero COVID strategy. COVID continues to threaten the global supply chain recovery. Recently, China and Hong Kong saw a huge uptick in COVID infections. China's attempt of a zero COVID strategy can result in more lockdowns and port congestions and possible closures. As we all know, China is a major manufacturing hub and accounts for a large amount of goods we import to the U.S., 506 billion to be exact in 2021. Due to COVID, China is already experiencing a lack of truck drivers and warehousing operators, which means delays in filling shipping containers and longer dwell times. Right now, the Yantian port, one of the world's largest gateways, is partially open, but if it closes, in addition to reduced availability of product, we can expect to see increased shipping costs as vessels redirect to other already congested ports. Also, the whiplash of ports reopening will undo any progress made last year in the U.S. due to reduced lead times. And this can put us right back where we were when we looked at the slides for U.S. goods being import, how we saw that huge dip, and then the reopening caused a massive uptick in manufacturing goods coming back into the port, and which resulted in more ships awaiting berths. Another thing that we're watching here is the Russian and Ukraine conflict. In addition to COVID, the ongoing Russian and Ukraine conflict was another black swan event that no one could have predicted that's affecting the supply chain. One obvious issue is the impact of the conflict on oil. Russia was the number 2 oil producer in the world last year, and since the onset of the war, we've seen a 25% increase in crude oil. At $122 a barrel, that also represents a 56% increase since the beginning of the year. As sanctions persist, we will continue to see upward pressure on oil prices. However, there's another impact that's the squeeze in the metal markets. Before the conflict, we were already seeing steel prices surge to more than 125% in 2021 compared to prices in 2020, before moderating towards the end of the year. Together, Russia and Ukraine are the second largest steel exporters with 43.8 million metric tons. Since the onset of the war, prices have escalated for rebar and other metal products while availability has dwindled. Russia is also a major producer of aluminum and copper. Since the conflict began, we've seen prices increases for aluminum as high as 13%, while copper has reached an all-time high of $4.80 per pound. Ukraine is a global provider of clay using ceramic tile and other major inputs to construction. Since the onset of the war, imports from Ukraine has halted. This conflict has also affected manufacturing of construction machinery. Ukraine's 2 leading suppliers of neon, which produce about half of the world's supply of the key ingredients for making chips, has halted their operations as well, threatening to raise prices and aggravate the semiconductor shortage. Lastly, cybersecurity attacks. In 2020, North American ports reported a 158% increase in ransomware attacks, according to PBS NewsHour report. This is a growing concern since a successful attack on networks running machinery could potentially disable a port completely. We saw this a few weeks ago when freight forwarders Expediter International, a large global logistics firm, had to partially shut down its operations for a little more than 2 weeks due to a ransomware attack. They were unable to submit U.S. custom forms because they only had access to email and phone, posing a serious issue for the 350 locations that they manage globally. This all leads to extended lead times as well as an increase in materials due to the increase in cost for shipping. So hopefully you enjoyed what we've presented so far on the impacts to construction and the supply chain and how HIT is handling these issues with several examples provided by Drew on the mitigation strategies. Right now, we're going to kick it off to Q&A and take some questions from the queue. Our first question that we have is, with price escalations due to higher material costs, will there be a decrease in jobs performed and hence lower wage costs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, listen, there's no downturn of the amount of projects that are coming at us, and in fact, right now, the interiors market, the tenant market, is still just starting to recover from a construction perspective, right? There's still a vast majority of U.S. Folks that are not back to their office, and in like the less than 20% category, even if you called it 50%. But all those projects have taken a stern halt as our design partners are quickly trying to evaluate what is the best strategy to move forward. So we don't even have that full pressure of the tenant market putting additional pressure on the overall supply chain. So we are as busy. We see as many opportunities as we ever have. I think many of our peers are in the exact same position. We talk to almost every one of our design partners. There's a constant hiring and a constant looking to increase their overall capacity, but the drain is definitely not there. In fact, the mountain continues to grow.
We have another question. Describe the advantages of having a contractor on board early for pre-purchase, such as design build or CM at risk delivery methods, versus an owner pre-purchasing equipment like design bid build delivery method.
Sure. I mean, that's a question we talk about a lot.
Yeah, I can jump on that first, Drew. Really, that's what our department does in pre-construction is we're constantly working and partnering with our owners to bring on, it's one great step to bring on a general contractor up on early, but it's the next smart move to bring in a subcontractor on early. Just like Drew had mentioned earlier, the sooner we can bring them in, the sooner we can lock down their materials, their pricing, their ideas on how to bring the design together. Because again, the old world of that design, bid, build, we're missing out. You're missing out on the opportunity to help lock down those costs early in the phase. So with us, what we're trying to do with a lot of our partners is negotiate these opportunities up front, bring in our trusted partners. We go through qualifications. We get competitive pricing for them, kind of in that SD/DD range. And then from there, whether it be steel, whether it be precast, whether it be the mechanical, the electrical equipment, right? We bring all of those components in so we can help lock it down, ease the path of not only of the design and permitting, but also in the construction sequence, so we can have all the material available to hit our critical path that's out there. On the flip side is we do work with a couple owners that do some pre-purchasing of the equipment. They hand it over to us. It works. It's a little bit clunkier, but again, if we can help control that and take that risk on for the owner, we can then again deliver a better wrap package for our clients.
Well, plus, Gail, I think as you showed on the slide that showed under petrochemical, metal, and brass, there's so many pieces that go into this. It would be very challenging for an owner to pre-purchase enough of components like steel conduit, metal studs, rebar, in order to get truly those savings that are really putting the pressure on.
We have another question. Regarding price instability, how do subs balance timing of purchases with fluctuating prices, and to what extent do they, or can they, choose which GCs or end clients will receive better pricing as a result?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question.
Really?
You know, what's interesting is a lot of our trade partners are having to become, futures traders or commodity traders, trying to best predict how much the increases are during their period of time. And so what we've done is we broke that down into, into bigger chunks so we can start to understand what they're looking at. So if you take a drywall contractor, for example, right? At some point, they got to buy the metal studs. If we're building a new building, when do we buy the metal studs for that project based on where this escalation sort of is continuing to rise at or start maybe to fall off? And we've done a few different options. We've worked on some projects where we've held off on procuring the drywall trade until the building's much closer to needing that trade. Didn't really help us in any scenario by getting a better pricing because, as we show, steel is still going through the roof. Today, given the impacts that we see today, especially with the new piece of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what we do is, as we keep saying, let's buy it early and let us house it, right? Because right now we're not seeing that deflationary pressure yet. We haven't seen any downward push onto the submarket. So for the subs that really want to do business with us, paying them, working with them up front and allowing them to be part of the solution so that they have a better chance of pulling the levers that they can in order to make the project happen. And then that also gives them a lot more confidence in workforce planning so that they know what their labor needs to be, at any given period by being way up front in a project. When we're releasing projects and saying you need to be out there tomorrow or in a week or in 2 weeks, all that's doing is creating subcontractors to have to find solutions by bringing on second or third tier trades, outsourcing labor, all these other newer strategies in order to meet the demand of ourselves and our clients. So, early is a huge part of that balance.
I was going to add on to that there too, Drew. Last fall, I was a part of a conference call it was called the National Roofing Crisis. It was held by the 6 major roofing manufacturers across the country, and they were really just talking about the impact of all the delays and escalation that they've been experiencing across the country. And a lot of what they discuss is a lot of what we presented here today about the shortage of raw materials, the freeze, the hurricane out there in Texas. But really one of the funnier things that they kind of went through is that every contractor, right, every subcontractor is trying to do what us general contractors are trying to do. We're trying to facilitate our owners and hit our schedules. And by doing that, we're all trying to buy as much supply as we possibly can. What these manufacturers were saying, what these roofing manufacturers were saying during that call is, please pull back your orders. Stop order. If you just want it from me, just get it from me. But don't order it from me, then him, then her, then him. Because it's almost a repetition of what like the toilet paper crisis was for all of us back in 2020 when we first got into this pandemic, where there's a massive shortage of roofing membranes and everybody was ordering it 3 times over. They couldn't really tell what's real and what wasn't real. And that's really what's also helping perpetuate this the supply chain issue that's out there.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question that actually kind of follows up to that. If you are pre-ordering materials, does storage become an issue?
Yeah. It doesn't, because you can't order enough in advance of, right? So there's 2 sides to that. The production availability is as much of an issue as it is, being able to control escalation, right? You pre-order to control the price increases, but the price increases are happening because the demand side is so high because the manufacturing can't keep up, and the labor market is still in a huge crunch. So we're feeling pressures on both sides. So there's definitely allocation components that go into effect at each piece, and it's definitely a part that, if you can't get it, you can't store it anyway. So striking that balance between all of these tactics that we have isn't just one thing. You can't just pre-purchase everything and store it. It's for this piece, you might be able to pre-purchase. For this one, you might change what you're looking at as far as the assembly. For this one, it might be, how do we work with, a totally different construct of building it out of a different material. So each piece is very independent and unique, and there's not one size fit all for any of these solutions. It really is dependent on which factor is at play at the time of the issue.
We have time for one more question. Do you see the labor market stabilizing yet in the manufacturing and or trade workforce areas?
No.
We're definitely not. Again, I can bring back that roofing crisis. And in that conversation with the 6 major roofing manufacturers, they're all asked a very similar question. If you had all the material right now, when can you get the material to us? Their response then was at least 12 months, could be 18 months. And that was like about 6 months ago. So like we had presented earlier, we're probably still in that 12 plus month time zone in order for the stabilization of these manufacturers and vendors trying to catch up on all the deliveries that are out there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, well, just in closing, we just want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was quick. We could probably talk about this for another 4 hours. It is something that we're living on a almost an hour by hour, minute by minute basis as things pop up. But I want to make sure everybody knows there's a post-event survey. Please share your feedback with our team after today's session. Very critical to us. This isn't what we do every day. We just want to make sure we're covering the right points and hitting the right topics that you can take something away. And also, the presentation will be linked in a post-event communication that'll be coming out to everybody, so you can share it as you wish. So thank you again, everyone. We appreciate your participation, and keep the questions coming.